What I'm going to do is talk about an analysis that we had done just looking at the biotechnology options and the agro-ecosystem in two different sectors of the world, and making that comparison to see if we could learn some lessons about what might be the most sustainable agricultural path we could follow. I think if we did a survey, there would be some common goals we had in agriculture, and they would undoubtedly be that we all want more nutritious and tasty food. We want to use less land for agriculture, more for biodiversity. We'd want to have fewer external inputs like pesticides and fertilizers. We'd want to use less water, and we'd want to use or release less carbon. I think those are some basic fundamentals that we'd all like from agriculture. So how do we do it? Well, there have been some very strident claims made about what is the best way to achieve those outcomes. For example, Nina Fedorov, who is a past president of the U.S. National Academies of Science and also a science advisor to then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, has said unequivocally, the science is quite clear on the benefits of GM crops. And the reason farmers turn to genetically modified crops is simple. They increase yields and they decrease costs. So the science is clear. The claims can be made based on that science. So we decided just to see how well that science stacked up when we compare agroecosystems who have chosen GM and those who haven't. So the analysis was to look at two regions of the world. One, North America, predominantly the Midwest of the United States, but also Canada. Two countries that were early adopters of genetic modification. And compare that to a UN FAO group called Western Europe, which is a composite of nations like France, Germany, the Netherlands, etc. And the reason we chose them is because the two groups are in the same hemisphere, so we have the same annual cycle for their cropping. They're roughly the same latitudes. They are both developed economies, so they have a long tradition of agriculture, and they have the wealth to access the most recent biotechnologies available. There's no differences in their ability to access biotechnology, but there are differences in the biotechnologies they choose. They have access to elite germplasm, and they're both mechanized and have high levels of education in their farming sector. So we don't have two Earths, so we can only compare different countries in this study, but we tried to minimize all of the variables that can confound an analysis when we look at biotechnology choices. Every study has its limitations, and our country-level analysis is no exception. But likewise, meta-analyses based on an accumulation of field-scale studies also have their limitations. So just as a disclaimer, before we start, we'll say, my study has potential benefits because I can look at long-term data sets. We looked at over 50 years of data for our studies. So it's long-term and it's massive scale. It's nation-state level scale. So that gives us a form of statistical power that's lacking in field study type analyses. But field study analyses are potentially stronger in that they can put a field side by side and say what's happening at that location under highly defined conditions. My study lacks replication because, again, as I've said, we only have one Earth so far. And therefore, I couldn't replicate it by running multiple plants. However, the field-level studies in operation tend to be dominated by very short-term studies. In our analysis of most of the meta-analyses, we find that the average maximum is a one-year trial. 4 years is an extreme outlier. So 1 to 3 years of data at most for most of these studies. They're very small scale, and they're not controlled for the data input as carefully as you might like. Some of the data input is farmer surveys. What do you think your crop did last year? And some of the data is actual measurements of yield. Moreover, in practice, the meta-analyses we've analyzed tend to overlook studies that have qualified for their entry criteria, but which did not come to the same general conclusion of the meta-analysis, even though those studies that they've ignored were the longest-term, largest-scale studies available. So both kinds of analyses have their limitations. We're going to look at them at face value. And I'm going to begin this story by looking at maize. In the United States, what we're seeing is a low germplasm biodiversity, depleted soils in the Midwest. You know, it was famous for its 3 meters of topsoil, now down to a few centimeters, which requires lots of external inputs to keep it moving. We have a reduced farmer contribution to farming and a reduced farmer power. Less and less can the farmer say about how he or she farms. There's fewer choices because seed availability is concentrated, and in the US, at least in the staple crops, you don't really buy seed, you buy a biotechnology package. So you're stuck with that package if you want any kind of insurance. There's a high pesticide use that's undisputed, and there's a concentration of breeder power, which means that there's a concentration of intellectual property rights instrument power. So how did we get there? Well, if we look at, just do a simple comparison between the biotechnologies chosen by the United States and Canada versus the package of biotechnologies chosen by Western Europe, the outstanding difference is the choice of whether or not to go GM. Now that sounds like a simple difference, but it's not a simple difference. Because as soon as you take on GM, you take on lots of other socioeconomic differences. And I alluded to those before with the intellectual property rights package. So GM comes with a very powerful intellectual property right, which conforms farmers and the ability and what they do considerably to the package offered by the company. Western Europe has been free to innovate in other ways in which it grows crops, not constrained by the same intellectual property rights restrictions. You may have heard the latest phrase, which is GM is just another tool in the toolbox. Don't get all worried about it. It is another tool in the toolbox. The problem is when it gets in the toolbox, all the other tools leave. There's no more room for any other tools, and that's kind of the difference. So we just did a simple comparison between yield outputs in those Western European countries versus the United States. And what I hope you see here, I'm not sure how this works. Maybe this is no. This one? This one. Ah, yes. I hope what you can see here is that these lines are pretty much the same. So what we have is Western Europe in the blue and the United States in the brown. They're tracking together. Now this is a 50-year data set. They didn't start out together. Listen, this is the United States in the beginning of the data set. This is Western Europe in the beginning of the data set. So Western Europe has gone from a period of average lower yields than the United States to a period actually of higher average yields than the United States. So the slope of that line is steeper than the slope of the line for the US, which projects to even faster growths in yield than the US, despite not choosing GM as a supplemental biotechnology. The other thing I hope you'll notice and we'll return to is how much the brown line jumps up and down. It's sort of like reading my heart rate right now, right? It's just all over the show. Whereas the European line is a little bit more sedate. And if you know the difference between Americans and Europeans, you would see that right away. Now, so here's those the slopes on those graphs, which are trend lines. So what you see for Western Europe is their trend line slope is 1344, and the U.S. is significantly lower at 1106. This means, and our data set here ends at 2012, this means that at that time, Western Europe was projecting to be leaving the U.S. behind. And you've probably never heard that before, because it's always the U.S. is leaving Europe behind. And in this case, at least in maize, the projections are that Europe is at least keeping pace and possibly is even a superior maize producer. But as another measure of resilience and sustainability, we looked at resilience. Now I mentioned before my heart rate. Now this is the variation from year to year in yields. The number of kilocalories by which that line varies, this is the 2012 drought, is 89 trillion kilocalories. This is something like 5 or 6 times the number of calories lost in the potato famine in Ireland. And this is nearly an annual event in the U.S. The variation in its annual yields are larger than the loss to the world of food in historic famines. Whereas Western Europe does have some variability. I mean, we even have the 2003 historic drought in Europe. It is not varying as much. This tells us, for better or worse, whatever the Europeans are doing, their cropping system appears to be more stable year to year and more predictable year to year than the American cropping system. So even if from time to time the U.S. exceeds European levels, it's also less predictable. And those differences were significant trends. Maize isn't the only GM crop, and the United States is not the only GM producer. So we also looked at Canada. Now there's no surprises that Canada has always had lower yields in oilseed rape crops than Western Europe. No surprises there, but pretty different. So what's important here is to look at the trends in yield, increase in yield over time. Again, over our 50-year data set, you see the Canadian yields are pretty flat over that entire period, whereas Western European trends continue to grow. This area here is when GM became introduced as another tool in the toolbox. You see no decrease relative to Canada in the rate of increase in yield. So the Western Europeans continued to increase their yield, and they did so even faster than the Canadians. So no one expects the Canadians to make as much per hectare as the Western Europeans. But we do expect them to make biotechnology choices that increase their yields commensurate with their claims about the technology. We then also looked at a crop that's not GM in either agri-ecosystem. This was wheat. Nobody has commercial GM wheat. Once again, 50-year data set. This is comparing the US and Western Europe. The United States wheat yields are flat, nearly flat, over the entire 50-year period. That's why the US is so nervous about its yields. And that's why it keeps using wheat as a poster child for why it needs GM. Meanwhile, Western Europe has steadily increased its yields of wheat without using GM. This tells us that the Western Europeans have, even in their industrial agriculture, chosen a package of biotechnologies that are increasing yields in all of their crops. And the U.S. has foregone a critical element of biotechnology that is penalizing yield gains in all of its crops, GM or not. So the important thing here is the agri-ecosystem. you need to choose the right package in order to increase your yields and hopefully as well decrease your cost on the environment. So let's see how the Europeans are doing there. Well, here's US insecticide use over the period, between the periods when it first adopted, just before it adopted GM, and to the last reporting year. The Bush administration stopped this agency from continuing to monitor these numbers, so this was the last possible year we could get them. And what you see is a good news story. When it comes to insecticides, the US decreased its insecticide use between those two periods by about 15%, 15 to 20%. It increased its herbicide use marginally. So bad trend there, and we know that trend has to do with an increasing shift in the use of a single management strategy for weeds in GM crops. Now, I won't belittle that 20% decrease in insecticide use because insecticides are bad and I'm glad to see them go. But part of this is an accounting issue. All of the GM crops that make their own pesticide don't get counted here. So the US is still releasing pesticide just in the form of a biopesticide because it's in the crop, rather than spraying it on separately as a formulation, and it doesn't account for both kinds in these stats. So if you simply shift out some of your pesticide from the accounting line, it will look like a decrease. Nevertheless, not all of that might be simply an accounting issue. There may actually be real decreases in insecticide use. So let's compare that to France. Now, France is one of Europe's biggest producers of, say, maize and wheat. So it's a good comparison, and it's one for which we could get some decent stats. Here again, compared to our baseline 1995, we see that France has done two things. It's actually on a trend to decrease herbicide use. Note, though, that France still uses more herbicide per hectare than the US, but at least it's on the right trend. And now the US has caught up. And it's decreased its insecticide use without choosing GM, without doing any accounting, funny business with accounting, to 24% of its 1995 levels, all by 2007. By 2009, because the French were still making stats, they had decreased insecticide use to 12% of their 1995 levels, and their herbicide use was down to 82% of their 1995 levels. So this tells us a couple of things. One is, maybe there's fewer pests in the world, and everybody can decrease their insecticide use, or maybe the French know something about integrated pest management that the Americans don't. I wouldn't judge. So what are the lessons we have learned? Well, the US is getting relatively low yields. It'd be wrong to call the US a low-yield country. It's not a low-yield country. But its industrial agricultural system is not necessarily producing at its maximum. And likewise, while it's floundering below Western Europe, it still has a high pesticide use rate, and it has socioeconomic problems as a result of its biotechnology choices, many of which I'm not going to go into here, but which we know of, like low germplasm biodiversity, reduced farmer power, and reduced farmer choice. The US agro-ecosystem and research investment has been in genes. And yields are much bigger than genes. As we know, it's about how you farm, not just the cultivars you farm with. So the problem with US agriculture is not specifically GM. That is, GM is not the cause of the germplasm concentration, farm size decreases, yield stagnation, etc. It's not the cause. But it's a codependent with those things. It accelerates those very trends because of the nature of the tool that it is. Now, we received a few criticisms of our study. One of them was, why did we use 50 years? As if using shorter periods of time and using less data was somehow now something a scientist should do. Well, what we pointed out was that if you use progressively shorter times to construct your story, you find that you construct very different narratives. as expected by the critics, but the narrative wasn't what they expected. So if you look at this red line is showing the United States to 2010, from 2000, so beginning of the big GM era for maize, to 2010. So if I just arbitrarily choose those years, GM maize looks good. If I add just one more year, this is the line when I add 2011. It decreases 28%. If I add 2 years to 2012, it decreases another 78%. When your data set changes that much by adding 1 year, well, you say, we can't do it that way. We need the bigger data set. But to appease the critics, what we did is we said, well, let's look at the time period when 90% of the maize was being grown. 90%. The red line is the trend line for the US. Over the period of time when 90% of GM maize was grown, it's flat. During the same period, Western Europe was increasing by 1,200 hectograms per hectare in the exact same period. This is the line when you look at the time 75% of the maize was being grown. The US yields are decreasing at a whopping 1,200 kilograms per hectare during the time when 75% of its maize production is GM. Contrast, Western Europe increasing by 2,500 kilograms per hectare. And if you overlay a short period of time, that 2000 to 2012 period of Western Europe, with its 50-year trend line, they're almost indistinguishable. That means Western Europe has chosen a package of biotechnologies that is explanatory for its incremental, steady, and reliable increase in yields over the last 50 years. So this, to me, does not mean that Western European industrial agriculture is the answer. So I'm not here being an advocate for how the Western Europeans do it. I am just here to contrast what look to be definitive statements by leading scientists telling us that GM was the answer. Agroecology, by a number of measures, is turning out to be what looks most like the answer. Here's a United Nations study in Africa where they compared a variety of different trial sites over a number of years, and they found switching farmers to agroecological farming methods increased yields by up to 200%. Now, that's real progress with far fewer external inputs, so greater resilience and sustainability, and they had socioeconomic benefits that were not achieved through conventional agriculture. So what might be our future directions? We have to realize that technological innovation and improvements in technologies that support agroecological work are probably our most promising outcomes, and that's supported by lots of research, including the ISTAT. It must be customized to the receiving environment. That's important. So making seeds in St. Louis and sending them to Kenya is not the answer. And the main incentive, really, should be sustainable societies rather than simply sustainable farms. The farm is there to support the society, and it has to be a closed loop. So the socioeconomic outcomes of your biotechnology choices have to be factored in to how you want to make your agroecosystem work. Thank you for your attention. I just want to thank my co-authors and once again the organizers for the conference.
Great.